At 11:47 p.m. on November 13, 1942, Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan watched through binoculars as something that shouldn't have been there emerged from the darkness of Iron Bottom Sound, just 3,000 yards away, practically point-blank range in naval terms. 2 Japanese battleships were upon them. It was a perfect trap. The Japanese knew the U.S. Navy was at an absolute technological disadvantage in night combat. Their admirals had trained for years in nocturnal battle tactics, they possessed superior torpedoes, and above all, they had the battleships Hai and Kurashima, armored giants capable of shelling Henderson Field and changing the course of the Pacific War that very night. But there was one flaw in the Japanese plan. A destroyer they considered insignificant. A crazy vessel that was about to do something technically impossible, something no naval manual had ever foreseen, something a Japanese admiral, upon hearing the reports days later, would refuse to believe, turning a 36,000-ton battleship into smoking scrap in just 7 minutes using only 5-inch guns. The name of this destroyer was USS Laffey. And what happened that night would forever change the rules of naval warfare. To understand the magnitude of what was about to happen, we need to go back a few weeks. By October 1942, the battle for Guadalcanal was at its most critical point. The Henderson Field airfield was the key to controlling the South Pacific, and the Japanese were determined to retake it. The strategy was brutal and simple: bombard Henderson Field overnight with battleships, destroy the runway, and land 13,000 troops before the Americans could react. If it worked, Guadalcanal would fall, and with it, the entire American offensive in the Pacific would stall. Admiral Hiroaki Abe commanded the bombardment force, 2 Kongo-class battleships, Hai and Kurashima, each armed with 8 14-inch guns, 16 6-inch guns, and armor that could withstand virtually any destroyer attack. Accompanying them, 1 light cruiser and 14 destroyers. Japanese intelligence was clear: the Americans only had cruisers and destroyers in the area. No battleships. No force capable of stopping a night bombardment. Japanese supremacy in night combat was legendary: their night binoculars were superior, their long lance torpedoes had double the range of American torpedoes, and their crews had trained for years in dark battle tactics. On the American side, Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan knew he was at a mortal disadvantage. His force consisted of 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers, none of them adequately prepared for night combat. Worse, their radars were primitive and could not distinguish between Allied and enemy ships in the chaos of battle. But Callahan had one advantage the Japanese were unaware of: absolutely audacious destroyer commanders. And among them was Lieutenant Commander William Hank, captain of the USS Laffey, a Benson-class destroyer of only 1,630 tons, armed with 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedo tubes. Hank was known for his unusual combat philosophy: a destroyer is not meant to run. It's meant to attack. Always. It was a suicidal philosophy against battleships. But that night, that madness would be the Americans' only chance for survival. At 1:24 a.m. on November 13, the radar of the cruiser USS Helena detected the Japanese fleet at 27,000 yards. The problem: neither Callahan nor his crew could interpret the radar data correctly. The signals were blurred. It was impossible to know how many ships there were, what type they were, or even if some of those signals were Allied ships that had shifted position. The American fleet sailed in a column formation, a straight line of ships following one another. It was the worst possible formation for a night battle, as it limited the firing angle and turned the ships into easy targets. But there was no time for complex maneuvers. At 1:41 a.m., the Laffey's lookouts visually sighted the Japanese ships. The distance had dropped to just 3,000 yards, less than 3 kilometers. In naval terms, this was hand-to-hand combat. And it was then that the Laffey's crew realized the horror of the situation: those massive silhouettes were not cruisers. They were battleships. Lieutenant Commander Hank faced an impossible choice. A destroyer against a battleship is like a dog attacking an elephant. The Laffey's 5-inch guns did not have enough penetration power to pierce the Hai's 12-inch armor. Torpedoes were the only real weapon, but they required distance and time to launch, 2 luxuries Hank didn't have. At 1:48 a.m., hell began. The High opened fire with its 14-inch guns. Each shell weighed 1,400 pounds and traveled at over 2,500 feet per second. A single hit would completely obliterate the Laffey. The Japanese destroyers also opened fire, and within seconds, the strait turned into a carnival of death, red and yellow tracers crossing the water, explosions lighting up the night like hellish lightning. And it was then that Hank made the decision that no naval manual would approve. He turned the Laffey directly toward the High. Full speed. 34 knots. Collision course. The crew thought the captain had gone mad. They were rushing directly at a battleship. But Hank knew something the Japanese didn't expect. At such close range, the High's main guns could not depress low enough to hit a small, fast target. It was like trying to shoot a fly with a hunting rifle as it buzzes around your head. The 6-inch secondary guns could hit it, but Hank was betting on confusion and speed. At 1:50 a.m., the Laffey fired all 5 of its 5-inch guns at maximum cadence. The distance was now only 1,000 yards, less than a kilometer. The American shells began to hit the High's superstructure. They didn't pierce the hull armor, but they exploded against the bridge, fire control towers, night binoculars, and communication systems. Admiral Abe was on the High's bridge when the shells began to explode around him. Shrapnel raked the bridge. Men died instantly. Communication systems were destroyed. The crew panicked. No one expected a destroyer to attack this way. It was suicide. But it was working. For 7 interminable minutes, the Laffey sailed alongside the High like a pit bull attacking a bear. The 5-inch guns fired non-stop, over 200 shells in 7 minutes. Each one exploded against the superstructure, destroying antennas, puncturing unarmored compartments, and causing fires. And then, just 20 yards away, the length of an Olympic swimming pool, the Laffey fired its torpedoes. 2 Mark 15s, each carrying 600 pounds of Torpex explosive. At that range, the torpedoes barely had time to arm before hitting the High's hull. The first explosion tore a 30-foot hole in the hull below the waterline. The second exploded near the engine room. The High, a 36,000-ton battleship, shook violently. Seawater began to flood the lower compartments. But the High's revenge was brutal. Even damaged, the battleship still had teeth. Its 6-inch secondary guns finally managed to aim at the Laffey. At this distance, it was impossible to miss. At 1:57 a.m., a salvo of 3 6-inch shells struck the Laffey. The first pierced the hull at the waterline. The second exploded on the main deck, destroying 2 5-inch guns and killing 20 men instantly. The third hit the bridge, killing Lieutenant Commander Hank and most of his command staff. The Laffey was dying. Fires spread across the deck. The engine room was flooding. The ship began to list to port. But even while agonizing, its surviving guns continued to fire. The crew knew they were doomed but refused to stop. At 1:59 a.m., another Japanese destroyer, the Inazuma, fired torpedoes at the Laffey at point-blank range. One of them hit the engine room, splitting the destroyer in half. The Laffey began to sink rapidly. The highest-ranking surviving officer ordered the ship abandoned. Men jumped into the freezing water as secondary explosions ripped through the hull. At 2 a.m., the USS Laffey disappeared beneath the waves. Of the 247 crew members, 59 died, including its captain. But the Laffey's sacrifice was not in vain. The High was mortally wounded. The crew fought desperately to control the flooding, but the torpedoes had caused catastrophic structural damage. The steering system was damaged. Maximum speed dropped to just 10 knots. Worse for the Japanese, the confusion caused by the Laffey's suicidal attack had completely disorganized the bombardment plan. Other American destroyers took advantage of the chaos to launch their own attacks. The cruiser USS San Francisco fought hand-to-hand with the High, trading shots at distances ranging from 2,000 to just 500 yards. By dawn on November 13, Admiral Abe made the decision to cancel the bombardment of Henderson Field and withdraw his fleet. The Hai, unable to maneuver properly and with serious damage, was left behind with escort destroyers attempting to tow it. But the Hai's nightmare was just beginning. At dawn, American planes from Henderson Field, the field the battleship should have shelled, took off to hunt it. The slow, damaged Hai was a perfect target. Grumman Avenger torpedo planes attacked in waves. The first torpedo hit the port side. The second, the starboard side. Dauntless dive bombers dropped 1,000-pound bombs on the deck. The Hai tried to defend itself, but its fire control systems had been damaged since the Laffey's attack. At 6 p.m. on November 13, after 16 hours of agony, Admiral Abe ordered the Hai abandoned and scuttled by its own crew. Torpedoes from Japanese destroyers delivered the coup de grace. The Hai sank north of Guadalcanal, taking 188 crew members with it. It was the first time in history a Japanese battleship had been sunk by American forces. And it all began with 7 minutes of pure suicidal madness by a destroyer that refused to retreat. The naval battle of Guadalcanal would continue for 2 more days, but the crucial moment was that Laffey attack. The Japanese lost 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 3 destroyers. The Americans lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, including the Laffey. But Henderson Field was never shelled. Japanese reinforcements never landed. And the battle for Guadalcanal began to swing decisively in favor of the Americans. 6 months later, the Japanese would completely evacuate the island. Lieutenant Commander William Hank was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his extraordinary leadership and conspicuous courage. The official Navy report described his attack as one of the most audacious actions ever performed by an American destroyer. But perhaps the greatest tribute came from a captured Japanese officer months later, who upon hearing the story of the Laffey, shook his head and said, "We were taught that American destroyers would retreat." That captain was mad. But he was a magnificent madman. The USS Laffey DD-459 rests today at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound, along with dozens of other ships that fought in those cursed waters. But its legacy remains. Sometimes, the difference between victory and defeat is not in the size of the guns or the thickness of the armor. It lies in the audacity of a commander who refuses to accept the impossible, who turns a disadvantage into an attack, who chooses 7 minutes of suicidal fury over an hour of safe retreat. The Japanese did not believe the mad destroyer. And they paid for it with a battleship at the bottom of the ocean and a lost battle that would change the course of the war.